To those of you here in Robson House and to all of those of you online, welcome to the CHACR Friday lecture. And I'm delighted to introduce Stuart Lyle. Stuart joined DSTL, the UK Defence Science and Technology Laboratory, in 2012 after gaining a degree in war studies and a master's in strategy and international security. Primarily focusing on geopolitical analysis, he's then focused more on future land warfare and urban operations in particular. He's an advisor to the Army's Agile Warrior Programme, taught on the US Army Urban Operation Planners course, and is the DSTL lead for urban operations. He was also the lead for DSTL's Future Cities report, which explored trends in urbanisation and their implications for military operations. And we'll make sure that we put the link in the chat and also available to everybody here in person. Stuart's going to myth-bust common misconceptions about urban operations, misconceptions that often appear in military planning assumptions and could hinder the Army's ability to fight in the urban environment.
Good. Thank you very much. Thank you for the introduction. As I say, this is going to be covering off the most common myths and tropes that I've experienced when engaging with a military audience talking about urban operations, whether that be talking about from a training side, from a planning military operations perspective, or from a capability development area in Land Warfare Centre or Army headquarters. And these are the ones that I've mostly come across and actually do shape some of the decisions that get made. I just want to address something here today. So if you know some of these already, so the truth behind some of these already, then that's great. But it's like I say, these are the ones that I come across the most. This is usually where I end up sitting. Myself and my colleagues in DSTL, we're usually those awkward people in the corner asking difficult questions, asking for evidence before decisions get made, and asking what analysis has been done to support things. Or saying what the analysis has previously said, which might not necessarily be what somebody wants to hear. So this is usually where I find myself. Unfortunately, it's even more frustrating from an urban operations perspective because urban operations is usually treated as sort of the boogeyman of military operations. It seems that thing that's hard, it's difficult, it's too dangerous, we don't want to do it. And this is what the prevailing argument is. Unfortunately, a lot of the analysis doesn't necessarily support that. So I'm here trying to give comforting truth and say it's not as bad as you think it is. But mostly this analysis is getting drowned out by the myths and tropes. Now, some of this analysis goes back decades, and yet still not coming through the noise. The power of the myth is a strong one, and that's what I want to try and address today. So here's the list of the ones that I'm going to go through. And again, if this is your particular wheelhouse and you think that you already know this, then that's great. But these are the ones I want to address. I want to go through them in a bit more detail, explain what the analysis says, explain the source of where these things have come from, and then ultimately come to a bit more of a rationalised response to them and say whether or not it's true, false, or maybe. So the first one that I want to address is this one. The defender has the advantage. The reason I want to address this one first is that actually this tends to have a knock-on effect and tends to be a foundation for a lot of the other ones. And ultimately, this is not supported. So the defender has an advantage, predominantly at that micro-tactical level. If you're the soldier patrolling down that street and you don't know which one of the dozens of buildings and which window within those dozens of buildings you might get shot at from, then yes, the defender has that advantage. The defender generally gets to fire the first shot. But once they've done that, once they fire that first shot, they've expended that advantage and they're now in a fixed location, either defending a hard point, which you can bring something forward and engage it with something else, or joint fires, or they have to then relocate, potentially exposing themselves to ISTAR before they relocate to another thing, and they're trading terrain and space for that advantage as well. So at that micro-tactical level, yes, the defender does have the advantage. Once you step above that, and I'll go and explain why, that evaporates. Now, where does this come from? Mostly it's because the vast majority of our training takes place at that micro-tactical level. The limits of our training estate and the fact that we don't generally train an awful lot above company group level means that people's foundation of understanding, people's experience, is when they're facing that micro-tactical advantage. And people are then taking that and applying it when they're planning military operations at a higher formation level. Another is misinterpretation of history. If I were to ask us I'm not going to do it, it's going to take a while, but if I was to ask us to start naming off urban battles, and we put them into two columns, one where the attacker wins and one where the defender wins. The defender wins column would be a much shorter list. So this is not even supported by history. And actually, I've had to remind people on several occasions that the Russians actually won the first battle of Grozny. So how is it that the defender doesn't have the advantage? Well, simply because cities don't look like this anymore. We're not having to create a breach and an obstacle on the city walls. We're not having to funnel troops through the forlorn hope. And it was called that because once you created that breach, the enemy knew exactly where you were going to be going into the city, and they would concentrate their defences that way. It's not like that anymore. One of the things that I've heard about I'm a student of strategy. People will often quote Sun Tzu and say, the worst policy is to attack enemy cities. Now that's a misquote. What he actually said was the worst policy is to besiege walled cities. If you read beyond the fortune cookie version of Sun Tzu, the next two paragraphs, it talks about how slow and costly it is to produce siege engines and fill ditches and breach walls. So he's specifically talking about attacking settlements that look like this. He's not talking about cities in general. Cities look like this today. They're much more porous. So there's no forced element in the world that is going to easily be able to defend a hard stop on the edge of an urban area when a city looks like this. This quote, Frederick the Great, maybe encapsulates it all. The defender has to make very difficult choices about where they're going to concentrate those defences. Are they going to concentrate on multiple areas and try if the threat is going to come from multiple angles, or are they going to focus on key nodes within the city? They have to make those choices. Once the attacker's in the city, that is nothing but dead ground that they can exploit. So if you're in a city and you can hear an armor formation coming your direction, you don't necessarily know what actual bearing it's on, and you don't necessarily know whether it's 1, 2, or 3 streets away. So you're in that dead ground, and you can exploit that as the attacker. So ultimately, the defender is usually the weaker actor. You wouldn't be attacking a stronger opponent in an urban area. So that leans into the trend. The defender has to make those difficult choices. What do they do? What do they actually defend? The attacker has the initiative. Do they then press the attack and go straight in? Do they go on three or four axes and pose the defender multiple challenges? They have limited situational awareness. You've got this image here of the defensive position in Kyiv. I'm not going to comment on the actual utility of the sandbag emplacement, but as an illustration, the defenders here in this position, what's the limit of their situational awareness? Well, it's the front edge of those buildings right in front of them, isn't it? There could be a battalion's worth of infantry looking at them and they wouldn't necessarily know. So you can, when you're actually looking at a defensive position in an urban space, you're either in that deep urban canyon where you've got limited situational awareness yourself, or you put it up in a more obvious position, in which case it can be identified and it can be targeted more easily. So the defender has some really difficult choices to make. You can be shaped and fixed more. This is a battle map from the Second Battle of Fallujah. The Americans spent about 3 months before the battle putting in a very significant IU campaign to try and make the insurgents, well, two reasons. One, to get civilians out, and second of all, to make the insurgents think that the main thrust of the attack was going to come from the south and the east. They then attacked from the north. So what that meant was that the insurgents had made those difficult choices, and they put all of their effort into preparing defensive positions to the south and the east, and then the Americans attacked to the north. They had to leave the prepared defensive positions and then conduct an advance to contact against a threat that they knew nothing about and couldn't see. So why would we do urban defense? How do we do an urban defense? We have to train for both. So how do we do an urban defense? Well, actually, it's taking a more fluid approach to it. So trying to generate as many of those micro-tactical advantage situations as possible, but then also counter-attacking. So you allow the enemy to take a particular building, and then when you attack, you can leverage some of that advantage of being the attacker. When you look back through the analysis, most of the casualties an urban attacker takes is during counterattacks. It does require time and space in order to do that, so that's to factor into your plan. And also there's the threat of being isolated as well, if your entire urban area is cut off. But that ultimately is the most effective way, and history has shown that. The other way is shaping the attacker's approach to the urban area itself. So the way the Ukrainians did, the defense of Kyiv, where they dropped bridges and they flooded fields, and it forced the attacker to move along a much more narrow frontage, along a smaller number of avenues of approach, and it reduced some of the difficult decisions that the defenders had to make. So this one is false. So what are the force ratios? This one comes up an awful lot, and people say, well, we need a higher force ratio, we need a 6 to 1 or higher. So the US doctrine that came out last year says that against a prepared defensive position, you might even need a 15 to 1 force ratio. Now, the reason for this, the problem with this is not necessarily bespoke to urban, it's about a misinterpretation of what we mean by a force ratio. But it has the greatest effect when we're talking about urban operations, because that assumption that we need that higher force ratio in order to achieve success. It drives people towards being priced out of the market for urban operations. So if we keep it nice and simple, what is a force ratio? It's applying a numerical value to a force's fighting power so that you can compare it against another force for planning assumption. We keep it simple, the 3 to 1 force ratio that we're all kind of comfortable with. Can somebody here give me an analogy of what 3 to 1 might actually make? How would you translate 3 to 1? Anybody?
Three battalions attacking one battalion.
There you go. 3 battalions attacking 1 battalion. It's a 3 to 1. And that's really focusing on the number of personnel, really, isn't it? But if you're talking about putting a numerical value on fighting power is made up of 3 components: the moral, the conceptual, and the physical. But if we're just applying manpower as the metric for generating our force ratios, we're ignoring all of those other factors that feed into each of the other components of fighting power. And as a result, we then price ourselves out of the market and say, well, actually, in order to take out that company that's in that urban area, I now need to have a brigade's worth of troops because I need to have a 6 to 1 force ratio. And people will then say, I can't achieve that objective because I haven't got the force density, or I can't achieve that objective, or I can only resource 1 advance into that urban area and not 3 and 4, so that you can pose the defender greater challenges. If we apply that same trick, is that a 1 to 1 force ratio? There's obviously other things at play here. We've got 1 platform and roughly about the same number of people. So that would technically be a 1 to 1 if we applied that simplistic viewpoint. When we talk about force ratios, there's different types. This is where it gets a bit nerdy and in detail, but you've got force to force ratio, and that is comparing blob A to blob B. Here you've got a classic example from before Russia invaded Ukraine. Clearly, there were other factors at play, other areas within that numerical value of fighting power that came into play that stopped that being the very one-sided that would suggest. So all those other factors can clearly be incredibly important, and if we're not necessarily considering them and we're just going off manpower, then we're taking a very simplistic view of how we plan operations. Similarly, I've sat through presentations with senior army officers talking about the Battle of Mosul, saying the British Army, at best effort, couldn't do it. Now that's taking into account the fact that they've looked at the Wikipedia page and gone blob A, blob B, we don't have the force density to be able to do that. But in reality, that's not taking into account the context of how that operation was fought. The majority of the fighting was actually done by the Iraqi Gold Division, so it was a much smaller proportion of that overall size. And that takes us to force to space ratios. And this is the one where it's actually important. If you're going to use a force ratio for planning, you want to be looking at sort of force to space ratios. And that's looking much more at that point of contact. Got the picture there from the movie 300, awesome movie. There's a bit in there where King Leonidas is explaining why he's going to the hot gates and how his army of 300 is going to take on an army of 1 million. And he says, we're going to funnel them into the hot gates, and in that narrow pass, their numbers are going to count for nothing. Because he's taking into account all those elements of fighting power, better training, better leadership. And then in that narrow area where he's talking about at that point of contact, he knows that that force element that he's got up front is going to defeat whatever gets put against it. And that's what we're talking about when you want to do a force to space ratio. You want to be resourcing greater fighting power at the point of contact. It's not just all about what is around it. So ultimately, there's no equation for how to create a force ratio. There's no agreed equation. There's a lot of the analysis that gets done uses force ratios, but it has to be taken into the context of the equation that was used for that analysis. So there is some analysis that says with a 1 to 1 force ratio, you will have a 75% chance of success if you're the attacking force going into an urban area. But that force ratio analysis has to be taken in the context of the equation that was used for that analysis. It can't necessarily be applied everywhere. So ultimately, it's a maybe, because yes, obviously, you would want greater fighting power than your opponent. You'd be an idiot not to. But what we can do is just treat it as manpower, because what you'll end up doing is pricing yourself out of the market and saying, I can't achieve my objectives. So the next one, urban combat is bloody. I get this a lot. A lot of people say, we take higher casualties in urban. We're going to take we're going to take greater losses in urban, and we need to resource more medical to deal with blue casualties. Now, that is not actually supported by any historical analysis, because actually there's a number of factors that feed into it. And I'm going to just dive into those now, but none of the analysis actually supports it. Most of the analysis, in fact, all the analysis that I've seen, says that actually the attacker takes fewer casualties in an urban area than they would in a rural setting. Part of the reason for this is perception versus reality. So training limitations comes back to this again. People have either done TEDx's or their instructors have done TEDx's where we put laser engagement systems on everybody and they run around in an urban area and they fire on each other. The defenders are usually TED brave, which means suppression is less effective. Even if you've got a combined arms company group doing an urban assault, you generally can't measure or can't simulate through wall effects from 120mm or 30mm cannons or mortars. Those are more difficult to simulate. So ultimately, it ends up being an infantry running across open terrain because our training stations are generally uncluttered, assaulting into a building and then having to fight an attritional fight room to room against an opponent who will fight to the death. Now that's less realistic of real world scenarios, because if you've got a fanatical opponent who's going to fight to the death, you're going to be putting explosives into that building before you then enter it. If you have an opponent that's not like that, then they're not going to fight to the death in every single room, they're going to surrender or they're going to retreat. So the way that we conduct training doesn't necessarily reflect the reality of how these operations unfold. And at the end of an exercise, you'll have half the company sitting around beeping, smoking, just sort of waiting for the next serial to be reset. And everyone walks away from that saying, well, urban operations then clearly results in higher casualties. Another aspect is looking back at the historical case studies, you've got more visibility of the battle space and you've got compression. So the battle space is generally more accessible to photojournalists, so you see the casualties more. And then you're compressing larger force elements into a smaller geographical space. So you're concentrating the casualties that are experienced into a smaller space, they can then get photographed, and people will then make the assumption that they took higher casualties. The image on the left is Battle of Hue, often referred to as the bloodiest battle of the Vietnam War. But that is not true in the slightest. From the Battle of Hue, the US lost 216 killed. You compare that to the Battle of the Outram Valley, the movie and the book We Were Soldiers. The US already lost more killed. As a proportion of the force, it was also significantly bloodier. So from the US, from the attacker side, or even from the defender side, it doesn't actually stack up in terms of those numbers and figures. Another aspect is the way that we look at historical examples. People will often come together all of the individual battles within an urban space and take it as a whole, something that we don't necessarily do for rural battles. So people will talk about the Battle of Hue, and they'll include all of that. What they're not necessarily doing is breaking it down by the fight for the provincial buildings of the university, the fight to get over the Perfume River, and the Citadel and the Palace. When you actually break those down, those are individual battles that are all part of the wider battle for Hue. You look at rural fighting, here's one that happened exactly the same time, the defense of Quezon Air Base. The defense of the air base, the US lost 274, so it's already a higher butcher's bill than Hue. When you take into account the fighting for the hills around it to try and relieve it, and then to open up the G-Lock, the US lost about 4 times as many casualties as it did in Hue. And the casualty rates on the North Vietnamese side was quite the same. So we need to be very careful about how we actually are interpreting our historical examples when we're doing this. Generally speaking, like I mentioned, the defender takes greater casualties than the attacker. Mostly that's because a lot of the historical case studies where people get cut off and they fight on, or that casualties also includes wounded and prisoners of war as well. So the defender generally loses because they can get cut off. You don't necessarily see the company beside you getting pressed and then retreating, and then you retreat yourself. People tend to get cut off before they realise it. So again, why would we want to do it? Why would we ever want to do an urban defence then? Well, actually, and this is the truth, this is also important from attacking side, is you reduce the risk of these high casualty events. You've got famous example here with the Russians tried to conduct a river crossing, they got spotted and they got attacked with artillery and they lost an entire battalion tactical group in about 4 minutes. Because they were caught in the open and they got mass fire brought down upon them. I know there's a whole lot of bunkers under Avastal, it's just there for illustrative purposes, but it is generally much more difficult to inflict that level and velocity of casualties in an urban area compared to in a rural one. So you are reducing the chances of mass casualties both on blue but also on red, either as the defender or the attacker. You got to factor that in as well, and that tends to be why they end up taking longer. This is actually false. The one area where it's absolutely true though is civilian casualties. There will always be civilians present, no matter how hard you try. The Americans, I said, it's 3 months worth of effort in the Second Battle of Fallujah to try and get the civilians to leave. There's still estimates of about 20,000 people left in Fallujah. The Battle of Mariupol started the war with about 400,000 people. By the time the Russians got to the edge of the city, there's estimates of about 140,000 people were still left in the city. So a significant civilian population will remain. They either can't leave or they won't leave, and that's something that has to be factored in. Now, if you're not clued into NGOs and host nation support to help deal with some of those civilian casualties, then yes, that will overwhelm the chain. But from a tactical perspective, looking at blue casualties, urban combat doesn't necessarily result in higher casualties. So I'll put tanks in inverted commas. I know we've got some armor people here. And what I mean by that is armor. I'm not going to get into the debate about is it a tank, isn't it? And that's why I selected this image, which has got a broad spectrum of different armored vehicles. So this is one where I've had this quite a lot where people have said, I wouldn't put armor into an urban area. I've even had people who are armor specialists working on urban who've said, I wouldn't put armor into an urban area. So this is genuinely affecting the way that people actually think about urban operations. And I've seen plans for people who've used armor to support the break-in battle, and then they just flush infantry in after that. Once they've conducted the break-in, the armor stays on the outside, they wouldn't put it in. When our doctor actually says, get tanks in there, they're great. This has come from two main things. One is a misinterpretation of history. So people will fixate on those big examples where it's gone really badly. First Battle of Grozny being the classic one, and then the sort of the eye-watering armor losses that the Syrian army took a few years ago. And people will then extrapolate from that. We're also looking at case studies where people are using legacy Soviet armor, which we all know is more likely armor than a lot of the Western equivalents. So if you use armor like an idiot, you're going to get treated like an idiot, and that really can't be gotten around. But in reality, this doesn't necessarily hold up. A lot of the more modern case studies, we're looking at Western, it doesn't result in the same outcome. So we're going to talk about threat. Generally speaking, and there's a very simplistic diagram of all the threats facing armor, but ultimately you've got artillery rockets, you've got air and aviation, you've got high-end ATGMs working from 4K or more, working down towards closer in, you've got enemy armor, you've got shoulder-launched anti-tank weapons, and you've got landmines. So this is all the threats that we're seeing unfolding in Ukraine. Now let's transpose that armor into an urban setting. Well, actually, a lot of your air and artillery is constrained on what they can find and what they can shoot at. You've gun target lines for any of the gunners in here, and the clutter that presents. Likewise, you've got all the clutter that is actually reducing some of the ability to employ some of those high-end ATGMs. You've got short engagement ranges. The average engagement range for dismounted infantry is between 30 and 50 meters in urban. So that's well within the minimum safe arming distance for a lot of the high-end ATGMs or anti-tank weapons. We've seen the famous video of the NLAW fizzing out on the roof. Obviously, if you waited just another couple of seconds, it would have had a bit more range. But ultimately, this is what happens. Likewise, your infantry are no longer just passengers. They're dismounted. They're providing infantry screens. They're moving forward and clearing some of that complex terrain and providing eyes and ears for the tanks. Or armor, sorry. And then you're bringing your armor forward from a position of cover under the direction of the infantry. You're engaging those targets. You're breaking up those hard points, and then you're retreating back to cover. You might even be firing from a position of cover as well. So really, when you're using armor in an urban setting, you're presenting the anti-tank teams, but you're reducing some of the traditional threats. And then for the ones that are left, you're forcing them to use less optimal systems against less optimal targets at much greater risk to themselves. So all the analysis that has been shown shows that actually armour survivability increases in an urban setting than in a rural one. And that's been true from World War II all the way through to today. This is false. So logistics is significantly higher. The first thing I'm going to touch on is artillery, because this tends to be where a lot of the focus is on. People will look at the amount of destruction that happens in urban settings and say, well, actually, we need much more artillery because it takes more artillery rounds to reduce a building. And so that's what it's going to take. We also have some of these examples. This is a story from a single US Marine artillery battalion fired 35,155 rounds in a 5-month span. All the gunners are around as you go. I won't do that. You're not hearing about it, but it'd be fun. But part of that 5-month period was supporting the Raqqa offensive. So again, it feeds into this narrative that urban takes more artillery. However, what we're not doing is necessarily translating that to the context of it being a high-intensity conflict. And high-intensity conflict is high intensity regardless of the terrain. So here is what might seem insignificant crossroad. It's a dirt track that runs at the joining point for 4 fields in eastern Ukraine. Now that is not a significant terrain feature of any real merit, but you can see the level of destruction that's been thrown at, the amount of artillery rounds thrown at. Likewise, you got going back to the Battle of Hue example, which tends to be influenced a lot of thinking on urban operations. The Battle of Dakto happened about 2 months beforehand. Same size force elements, same size enemy force as well. 150,000 artillery rounds in 20 days. 2,000 tactical airstrikes providing close air support, and 257 B-52 arc-light strikes in support of that one operation. So urban operations can't be analysed in isolation from other high-intensity warfighting. Now, that's not to say that some things aren't harder. It's not necessarily just harder when you take it in the round, it's just different. We are trained, equipped, structured to support manoeuvre warfare in rural terrain. That's what we like to do, that's what we're good at, and that's what we're structured to support. We're not trained, equipped, and supported structured to support slow, short duration positional warfare in an urban setting. So it's just different. You will see some of your demands go up and some of your demands will go down. Dismounted explosive effectors, your demand's going to go up. Hand grenades, rocket launchers, that sort of thing, that's going to go up. Likewise, you're going to see a decrease in your overall artillery usage, but you're going to see an increase within that, different natures. So you're going to see an increase in precision-guided bombs and precision-guided rockets. So you see, it's just different, it just shifts. So if you're SO2 precision-guided bombs, you're going to have a harder time, but somebody else is going to have it easier. You're not going to be using as much fuel, you're not moving around as much, you're not driving around as much. In terms of small arms ammunition, yes, at that point of contact, go back to the 300 analogy, at that point of contact, you're going to have some pretty intense firefights, and you're going to have to be resupplying them pretty quickly with ammunition. But the vast majority of your force isn't firing. So overall, the analysis suggests that when you take it as at that force on the whole, your ammunition, your small arms ammunition consumption doesn't necessarily go up, but it is focused. The usage is focused in much smaller areas. But I said, we have to just consider that high intensity is high intensity, and we can't look at urban operations specifically and try and infer from that on everything else. The one area we do know is that you will double your water usage, and partly that's the physical demand of fighting in an urban area, but part of it as well is you're also going to be engaging with the host, local populace. And the easiest thing for the tactical formations to do is give somebody a bottle of water and pass them down the chain so they can get looked after properly. So you will see a greater demand for water because that's that immediate need that people want. But ultimately, depends. This is an easy one. Urban combat takes longer. Yes, that's true. It takes longer to prepare. It takes longer to do your planning, your rehearsals, adjust those logistics. If you just done a large maneuver warfare type activity, get to the city, you're going to have to then take some time to readjust, get some of the stockpiles that you know you're going to need, conduct the intelligence preparation, that sort of thing. And then when you actually start to conduct the offensive, yes, it is more complex. it is more complicated to do C2 in an urban setting, so it will ultimately take longer. However, the one thing I want to stress here is that not everything has to be like Mosul. Not every urban battle is going to be some 9-month slog that is going to define your entire career. That's not been borne out by history. Even modern examples, yeah, Mosul is a modern example, but in the Second Battle of Fallujah, less than 2 months. We can go back. We've got Second Seoul, Konigsberg, 6 days, mirroring the American thunder runs in Baghdad. Now, I wouldn't necessarily recommend thunder runs. That was based on an awful lot of intelligence that said that the defence wasn't going to hold up very well. So I don't necessarily advocate that. But the point I'm trying to make here is that urban operations don't have to just be 9-month slugs. And that's also something that I find people talk about when it comes to sustainment. We can't sustain it for this length of time, and how are we going to politically sustain operations at that tempo? It doesn't have to be that long. So this is more of a sort of general catch-all term, and it's when I'm saying planning sessions for conducting war games and wargaming urban operations, I find an awful lot of times people will self-constrain themselves by saying, I can't do that, that's illegal, and insert things. So whether that be area fires into an urban area, or no-strike buildings and protected status of buildings, or even the use of incendiary effects in thermal barracks. People will often say, oh, we can't do that, that's illegal, or they can't do that, that's illegal. And in reality, that's not necessarily the case. There are lots of international treaties and regulations that restrict the way that some of these effects are delivered in an urban setting, but it doesn't necessarily mean that they are illegal. And that's not necessarily my job to tell you what is and isn't illegal, but the point I'm trying to make is that don't self-constrain yourself. And unless you do know the legal basis behind those decisions, then it's not necessarily a place to make those judgments. Likewise, people will then advocate other things, so CS gas, or doing old-style sieges. There's another thing that comes up, so Battle of Hue, they use CS gas, Battle of Morale in 2017, they also use CS gas. Proved relatively effective, but it depends on how you measure that. But it was relatively effective, so it became part of the lessons learned. However, CS gas in a wartime footing, as an expeditionary army, in a wartime scenario, CS gas is restricted under the chemical weapons ban. So you need to be very careful before advocating the use of CS gas. You use crowd control, but the point is, I'm not a league guy, and a lot of the people that come up with some of these things aren't necessarily league guys. Same with sieges. There's a lot of legal restrictions of what you can and can't do when it comes to sieges. That doesn't mean you can't do it, but you need to be cautious of them. I am not a military engineer. I would not tell a military engineer how to lay a bridge. So do not make assumptions about the legality of particular courses of action without speaking to a league guy. I was at an event recently, and the planning team were trying to go down the high priority targeting list. There was a target that was identified, but it wasn't identified with enough granularity that they could do a precision strike on it. And they said, oh, well, we're going to have to keep throwing out our assets at it until we get it. And I would say, well, why not just use area fires? It's number one on your high priority targeting list. You can do a concentrated artillery strike on it. And they're like, oh, we can't do that because it's illegal. But it happened to be a league out of the room, they just weren't very proactive. So they got brought forward, free from the situation, and the league had said, yeah, that's fine. You can do that. So my point is, don't self-constrain yourself. You've got specialists, they're there for a reason, use them. Maybe. Okay, so those are the main ones that I've experienced that shaped the way that people approach and people think about and actually plan for urban operations. As you can see, the analysis doesn't actually support an awful lot of them, or you have to look at it from a different lens before you're actually using it correctly. What I want you to take away from this is that if you hear somebody using any of these tropes, either challenge them or ask them, okay, what's your evidence? If you hear somebody talking about a force ratio, whether it be urban or not, speak to them and say, okay, what do you mean by that? Where's that number come from? Is it a light roll platoon versus an insurgent section? Okay, well, if that's a 3-to-1, then what if it was an armored infantry platoon, would that still be a 3? Well, no, clearly it wouldn't. So make people think about these things a bit more. If you're going to use these yardsticks for planning, or these statements for planning, understand the context in which they're meant. Thank you very much.
And Stuart,